All right, while you are joining it, there are a few housekeeping notes in the chat that we will copy and paste as more folks join. But as you are listening, we do want this to be an interactive conversation. So you'll see that this session is being recorded. There are opportunities for you to ask questions using the Q&A function. And then please activate on social media. We are using the hashtag reimagining Black Health. Uh, Remember, that's reimagining INING. Otherwise, it will be reimaging Black Health. And that's not what we're talking about. We are reimagining Black Health. So hashtag reimagining Black Health. And then we have at Council BH is the Council on Black Health. At Dr. Whit Glover is me. At Siobhan Arline is our moderator. At Doc Career Perry is Dr. Joya Career Perry. And at Rev Dr. Starsky is Reverend Starsky Wilson. So please activate on social media. Help us keep the conversation going. I am going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Militia Whit Glover, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director for the Council on Black Health. And I just looked at the calendar, and yesterday was my 1-year anniversary in this role. So excited to be here. We had a productive first year, and I'm looking forward to continuing that work. For those of you who are not familiar with the Council on Black Health, our vision is realizing healthy Black communities, and our mission is to develop and promote solutions that achieve healthy Black communities. We remain forever grateful to the founder of our organization, Dr. Shariki Kumanyika, who started the organization in 2002 under our former name, the African American Collaborative Obesity Research Network. So those of you may remember us from that name. In 2018, we changed our name to the Council on Black Health to better reflect our mission and focus on chronic disease outcomes that impact Black communities that are in addition to obesity, and also our focus on the social and political determinants of health. And so our idea is that we want to really dig into and address the drivers of health issues. You can visit our website at www.councilbh to learn more about the work that the council does and to learn about our strategic pillars. So I just want to give you a little bit of a setting. You saw in your invitation that this was the first in a series for our workshop. We traditionally have had an every other year cadence with an invited national workshop. And what we decided to do this year, we have decided that we wanted to make sure that we kept with our cadence. Our last convening was in 2019. We did not want to miss a year, and so 2021 was our year to convene, but in knowing what's going on with the national pandemic, we did not think that we would be in a place to convene and gather together. However, we have also been participating in many Zoom calls this year, and we know that you as well as we could maybe are a little bit zoomed out. And so what we are proposing to do for our workshop this year is rather than having one long workshop, we are going to have a workshop that spans across the year to give you content to help you keep engaged with the council and for us to be able to have meaningful conversation. And so today is the first in a 6-part series. So we'll hear a conversation today that will help to level set us for our workshop convening that will happen in August. So we have session number 1 today, August 11th, from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern time. Please mark your calendars. Will be our main workshop convening, and then we will follow that with quarterly sessions throughout the year. And so you don't want to miss those. So do keep that in mind. And again, for those of you who are just joining us and who may have missed the initial chat, I believe Adrian's going to drop that in the chat again. As you are listening, please do add your questions to the Q&A function today, and please activate on social media using the hashtag reimagining Black Health, as well as the social media handles for the folks who are on the call today. So I am going to get out of the way and turn it over to Reverend Siobhan Arline Bradley, who is going to introduce our speakers for this dynamic session. So again, thank you all for joining us and look forward to continued engagement with you and the council.
Awesome. Dr. Wick Glover, thank you so much. Well, good afternoon. It's afternoon everywhere. Yes, good afternoon to all of our listeners. It is great to see you all virtually again for what I think is going to be an amazing series. When we decided to move forward in this direction, there could not be two better leaders to have this conversation. As Dr. Wick Glover did share with us, this is going to be a content series. And I know that many of you were interested, just like I was, on how we reimagine Black health, but also how we work through understanding this concept and conversation around decolonizing. So without further ado, and I'm not sure if I have host capabilities, but I want to go ahead and start the process. So I'm going to ask Dr. Joya Crear-Perry to open up her camera. Dr. Joya Crear-Perry is a physician, policy expert, thought leader, advocate, and she just really lays in the space of transformational justice. And I can just say, yes, she is my friend, and I'm so proud of her. She is the founder and president of the National Birth Equity Collaborative, where she identifies and challenges racism as a root cause of health inequity. She's a trainer, speaker. She was featured in Essence and also in 2020 honored by USA Today in its Women of the Century series and featured on Nightlines, Hear Her Voice. She has really a number of leadership spaces. She served previously as the executive director of the Birthing Project. She's also worked in the city of New Orleans, so she's a New Orleans girl, proud of it. She also is a principal and co-founder of the Health Equity Cipher and on the board of trustees for Black Mamas Matter Alliance. She's also an adjunct professor at the Tulane School of Public Health. So that's my alma mater. So I am so excited to have someone from New Orleans here. She's an undergraduate from Princeton University and Xavier University, where she received her medical degree from LSU, Louisiana State University, and completed her residency in obstetrics and gynecology at Tulane. She is a proud member of Alpha Kappa Alpha. She is married to Dr. Andre Perry and has 3 awesome children. So Dr. Crear-Perry, thank you for joining us. She'll get us started. And I'm going to ask the Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson to open his camera. You'll see we have a power-packed conversation today. He is the president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund, really pursuing the vision of a nation where marginalized children flourish, leaders prioritize their well-being, and communities wield the power to ensure that children thrive. This is a gentleman who has really led the charge in philanthropy. He's the board chair for the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy and the vice chair for the Forum of Theological Exploration. He also serves boards for Children's Defense Fund Action Council, Duke Divinity School, and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference and Sojourners. He previously was the president and CEO of the Deaconess Foundation, which is a faith-based philanthropy organization for child well-being and racial justice in St. Louis, Missouri. So all the work that has happened, particularly in advancing Black Lives Matter work when Mike Brown was brutally murdered in St. Louis, Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson was at the helm. His church was hosted the Black Lives Matter Freedom Rides to Ferguson while he was there. And now he has really begun to open the floor for new opportunities for children and their well-being. He earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Xavier University of Louisiana. Yes, there's a whole New Orleans thing happening here. Joy is the only New Orleans native, but the 3 of us all went to school in New Orleans. And he also has a Master's of Divinity from the Eden Theological Seminary and a doctorate of ministry from Duke University. He is a proud member of Kappa Alpha Psi and Sigma Pi Phi fraternity and is married to Dr. Latanya Smith Wilson, a dentist and child advocate, and they have 4 children. So it is time, my friends, to jump right in and have this conversation. So this is how it will go. We'll start off with each of them giving remarks, because this conversation is about decolonizing, right? So we're going to open it up. Dr. Wilson, I think you're going to set the tone, and then Dr. Crear-Perry will give us some context, and then we're going to have a really open discussion. So just think about us sitting in the living room. Don't think about the Zoom. We're in the living room right now, having a family conversation about not only reimagining Black health, but thinking about the real impact of colonizing in our minds and in our experiences as we look at Black communities in this country. So Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson, let's let the preacher go first to set framework, and then we'll close out with Dr. Joy Perry, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Again, chat is open. Tell us what you're thinking. Give us the amens. Give us the, oh my goodness. We want all that in the chat, and ask your questions in the Q&A function. Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson, set us up, my friend.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you. Thanks for the invitation. Always glad to be among friends and growing family. And to talk about these important topics for our folks and for our community. And so I want to begin by telling you about the best part of my day yesterday. Yesterday morning, I began my day in Harambee. Harambee, the key Swahili word that means let's pull together. Harambee is how we start the day in 68 cities and 25 states across the country that host Children's Defense Fund Freedom Schools. And so I had the opportunity to go to Boone Elementary School in Southeast DC to be the Read Aloud guest, which is a part of Harambee, this celebration of the beginning of our day with these young people. And the young people I was with yesterday were between kindergarten and sixth grade. And so I was reading to these elementary students. I had the opportunity, and I read to them this book, Undefeated, The Undefeated, by Kwame Alexander, that is framed as a love letter to America. Check that, a love letter to Black America. And it frames and it speaks of the unspeakable, talking about the realities of the loss of 4 little girls, showing the image of that memorial to Michael Brown Jr., but it also talks about the undefeated. The great challenge and overcoming of the underdogs in American heritage and history, a celebration of Black folks overcoming and becoming over against the odds. And when I read, as a part of Harambee, which has reading, but it's singing and dancing and joy from young people, these beautiful Black and brown faces that were gathered around me, echoing the 10,000 Black and brown faces who are doing Harambee at the same time yesterday morning, I got a question. My very first question came from a young lady who was standing to my right, and she was about 6 years old. And she asked me, one of those reminders that sometimes we use words that we think are small, but they're a little bit too big. She was the first person to ask me a question and the last person to ask me a question. And the first question she asked me is, what's an underdog? I said, an underdog is someone who achieves great things, even though people don't expect them to. And then we had questions from other people around the circle as we were gathered. And then she came back and had another question. I said, okay, what's your last question? You get the last question, you got the first question. What's your question? And she said, her last question is, she said, why don't Black people and white people like each other? And I told her, I said, unfortunately, some people grow up without exposure, without getting a chance to know other people like I'm getting to know you. And because they don't get to know other people, they begin to think that other people are bad, or that they become afraid of other people. And sometimes Black people do that, sometimes white people do that. And I thought, as I prepared for today's conversation, there was a helpful and healthy way to enter into this conversation about colonization and decolonizing our health. My frame, as we seek to understand this concept of colonization, is deeply informed by my work in philanthropy and my colleague by the name of Edgar Villanueva. As we today talk about decolonizing health, Edgar wrote a book about decolonizing wealth. And as he talked about decolonizing wealth with his indigenous background and indigenous grounding, he began to make an early distinction that I think is helpful for us. He said that conquering is bad enough. Colonization is even worse. Conquering, coming into a community and taking the best of its resources, exploiting, as we have seen over and over in history, is absolutely damaging. But colonization is conquering and then occupying such that one begins to attempt to make the people there as oneself, to remake others, I'm sorry, you know, as a preacher, in one's own image. Colonizing is the attempt, is a rejection, first and foremost, of an indigenous point of view. An indigenous point of view which calls all humanity and all creation to exist, to coexist one with another, where one understands oneself as a human to serve and to be part and parcel to the soil and all non-human beings around. The rejection of that is a separationist or a separatist worldview. A separatist worldview begins to see humanity as somehow distinct from the rest of creation, sees humanity somehow separate from those other beings in the world, and that separation, my young sister's name was Zionese. Zionese asked this question about why we don't like each other. Separation, King might say segregation, breeds a sense of scarcity and fear that then supports the concept of colonization because one feels the need to dominate the other in order to be comfortable one's self. So I come back to her, this idea of why some people don't like other people. And I hold it in conversation with my indigenous brother, who suggests that we come to the point of colonization from a place of a rejection of an indigenous worldview with a separatist worldview that calls us to other community, to other creation, to seek to protect ourselves by dominating and making others into ourselves, remaking another human, another people in our own image, conquering and occupying in order to inflict upon others our own perspectives based upon our fear. What does it mean to colonize? To colonize is to separate oneself from others, to set up systems in order to dominate others in the interest of making them in your own image because you fear them. This is the beginning of our experience of domination. This is the challenge that pervades our health, our wealth, our well-being, and our thriving. This is the colonizing effect that we experience here in the West and as a response to anti-Blackness in the context of white supremacy globally. This is the jumping point for our conversations. This is that from which we must get free.
Reverend Dr. Starkey Wilson, thank you for that sermon that you just gave us, because that set us up. I got folks writing in the chat already. We're making another human being for your self-interest. So Dr. Joy Crib Perry, bring this all together for us. I know there's some slides that are about to be shared to get her going. Yes. So Adrian, let's get the slides up and let's help Dr. Joy get going.
That would be great. Thank you so much. And I have to say, as the non-reverend on this call, on this talk, I just feel I'm in a little bit at a disadvantage, but I'm gonna try as a simple OBGYN to follow the Reverend Doctor's beautiful language and build upon it. Our journey as the National Birth Equity Collaborative has really been similar to the journey that you all are on, the Council for Black Health. Renaming yourself, reimagining yourself, thinking about what that means, and quickly, everywhere in all of our documentation, we changed from African American to Black. And why we did that is we wanted to have a core organizing principle in which to organize that signified that we were part of a global community. That yes, although we were people of African descent living in the United States of America, that our struggle is actually a global struggle. And that every place that we see silos, that we see the attempts to marginalize different oppressions and have an oppression Olympics, we were not going to participate in that, that we were going to really be a part of a global movement to end anti-Blackness and to end patriarchy and white supremacy. So that's how we began our journey on decolonizing as an organization. And that's honestly the journey that we're still on and the journey that I'm learning. And I'm hoping to take you on our learning journey today, and then maybe we could all learn together to move forward. So next slide, please, Malicia. So as I mentioned, our organization is about 6 years old. And we recently relooked at our mission and vision and added the fact that we now have a global division with several grants from going across the world. And our vision that all Black mamas, babies, and their villages thrives means that we have to decolonize how we think about our work and also how we work with each other, how we work in community. And when we're working in places like Kenya, Ghana, when you say the word decolonization, what does that mean, right? What we know that the father of Ghana, that in the end, when they were fighting for freedom, they were talking about the ending of colonization. That was in the 1970s, 1960s. So this idea of colonization is not one that's just simply in the Americas. It's a general tie around the world. So this believing in Black lives, the importance of leaning into this Black Lives Matter movement, and the fact that it was a global attention that was brought to it is because we are part of a global understanding of colonization. Next slide, please. You know, our work really focuses as an OBGYN. This clinical work is so small, and how that the impact of what I can do when I'm providing clinical care is so small compared to the 90% of our lives that's spent outside of the clinical encounter. And so that's why dismantling these systems of power and racism are so important. So our work, we really combine this clinical and social aspect to ensure that that all Black birthing people can thrive. Next slide, please. So when we started 6 years ago, there wasn't a definition for birth equity. There were definitions for health equity, equity in general. So we looked at all those and our mission and our vision, our values, and said, well, how do we ensure that we have birth equity? What does that even mean? So often we talk about equity as a place, right? Where we have fair and equitable resources distribution, but we know that the same people who are today hoarding power and wealth are teaching their grandchildren to hoard power and wealth. So we have to teach our grandchildren to fight for justice, joy, equality, right? And so that means we have to put the assurances, the policies, big P, like access to healthcare for all, and policies, little p, like how you decide what hours you're going to be open or who you're going to take care of, right? Those are the assurances, the policies for the conditions of optimal birth. So we don't want people just to survive birthing in America. We want them to thrive. So that means we have to be willing to address both racial and social inequities in a sustained effort. Next slide, please. And as you know, 86% of our time in this country has been under explicit racial oppression, right? So, and we don't even talk about this last 14%, we still have had police violence, mass incarceration, still doing hysterectomies and surgeries on people of color without consent. So although we've gotten rid of this legal oppression theoretically, we still have it embedded and deeply colonized inside of our structures and how we believe and how we create policies for all. And then we export that to other nations, right? Like this idea that climate change will be fixed if the uteruses of people who are having babies in Nigeria and India would have fewer babies, has its history and legacy in eugenics and is not based on any actual medical data or fact. We know that climate change comes from high income nations and high wealthy corporations creating pollution, not the uteruses of Black, brown, and indigenous people across the world, but that belief, that continuation, that belief that the othering, as Reverend Starsky mentioned, creates an ability to create policies that are harmful for everyone. Next slide, please. So back about 26 years ago now, there was a lot of conversation about reproductive rights. As an OBGYN, what we provide is reproductive healthcare services. So those are pap smears, hysterectomies, tubal ligations, abortion, contraception, infertility treatments. But we recognize that just having reproductive healthcare services, there are laws and policies that dictate how you can provide those. Who has access to sex ed? Who teaches it? What are they teaching? Those are reproductive rights, the laws and policies that dictate how we are able to do those things. Who has access even to birth control or information? But justice, we know that there was a right to own us. There was a right to murder us. There was a right to lynch us. There was a right to sell our children. So just because something is a right does not mean that it is just. So under what framework are these policies and these rights created? You'll hear this tension frequently between religious rights and reproductive rights. And you'll hear this conversation inside of governments as if they're equal. You know, we have religious rights versus reproductive rights. If we're talking about justice, you can have a much more clear conversation. Are we talking about the ability for me to have control, personal bodily autonomy, meaning If I want to have an IUD, I can. If I don't want an IUD, I don't have to. You don't dictate how I should have children. However, I have 3 children, as was mentioned. When they're all together, I personally feel like the little old lady who lives in a shoe. But it's not my job to tell people how many children they should have. There are people who have 8 children who are amazing parents. And so you can't look at someone based upon their skin color or their wealth and decide if they will be good parents or not. There are some wealthy people who are horrible parents. So this idea in the United States that wealth makes you a good parent makes no sense. To not have children, so much of our resources here are tied to utilizing your uterus to birth a child. In states that have not expanded Medicaid, you don't qualify unless you've been a childbearing adult. So that means you're not valuable for health unless you utilize your uterus to birth. This idea that you're not valuable unless you're creating production is deeply tied to American racist capitalism. And then the last one is really important as we think about the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and on the list goes. Black mothers, Black people want to parent our children in safe and sustainable communities. We're not going to get that just through access to contraception or abortion. We have to embed and enjoy and improve things like police violence, mass incarceration. So that means just like we show up for the marches for people around choice, we need folks to show up to our marches to undo the racism and the harm that's happening in our communities. Next slide, please. So then you have to understand what decolonization means, right? So if you say we are decolonizing research, we're decolonizing healthcare, we're decolonizing Black health, what does that mean? And it's the process of revealing and dismantling colonist power in all forms. So that means mentally, physically. Once, as Reverend Starsky mentions, once you come and take over a place and try to make someone in your own image, that means that the people who are living there, but also the people who you bring, like us, people of African descent who are now in the Americas. What does decolonization mean to us? What does it mean to be a people who want self-determination? He mentioned the principles of Kwanzaa. One of them is self-determination. When I'm on my international calls, most of the countries and the peoples who are still living under colonial rule, because they still exist today, are asking for self-determination. So that language hits me a lot differently than it did when I've been saying it my whole life during the Kwanzaa tenets. What does it mean for Black folks in the Americas to have self-determination, to move freely and to control our own wealth, our own destinies, to not have the power, to not have police violence just because of the color of our skin, to not have doctors and nurses treat us differently just because they see us and devalue us? What does it look like to have true self-determination over our data? Think about the data during COVID-19, how we didn't have access to who was dying by race, right? The self-determination, we had to fight to just get data disaggregated to show that Black and brown bodies were the ones that were dying, because we knew that to be true. So that's what it means to really have self-determination, to decolonize for ourselves as Black people in the Americas. Next slide, please. Because what we ignore is that colonization was not just something that happened here, right? So although this tension that I feel frequently when I'm in meetings with my Indigenous brothers and sisters around the term colonization and what does that mean, when I'm talking to Indigenous Africans, they're confused by our confusion as Black Americans, because colonization was a global phenomenon. Only the orange countries on here were not colonized. Everywhere else in the world was colonized. So there are Indigenous people all over the place, Indigenous Africans, Indigenous people in the Asian countries, right? So this idea of how do we undo the harm of a belief in a hierarchy of human value based upon skin color that was not just an American or a US-based phenomenon. This is not just about the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the United States, but it's a global phenomenon of believing and colonizing the world, a belief of a hierarchy of human value. So how does that show up? What does that mean for us as Black folks in the Americas? And I'm keep kind of saying that because we don't usually have those kind of conversations, right? And there's this tension between anti-racism and decolonization. And because we are so US focused, we get very lost in having to be an either or a binary conversation. I would argue that as Black folks in the US, we have to believe in both. We have to understand both anti-racism and decolonization, because we have been deeply colonized for hundreds of years sitting here in these United States of America. Next slide, please. So according to the UN, this is from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights from 2006, you need to have a recognition of indigenous Africans. Throughout Africa's variety of ethnic groups, some are structurally subordinate positions to the dominant groups. And the states, and this leads to marginalization and discrimination, domination by not only practiced by descendants of European colonists, but also the dominant African group, right? So if you're gonna do this work, understanding that what indigenous means is just so important. It made it so much easier for me because it's something that we have not had an opportunity to discuss. They cut across various economic systems and they suffer discrimination. So how do we show up as allies in this Council on Black Health when we're thinking about African immigrants, when we're thinking about Afro-Caribbean immigrants? Like what is our tie when we're thinking about how colonization shows up and how we're working with large white organizations, be it government officials, be it institutions, that we understand that this hierarchy of belief of human value is cutting across all the different threads. And our job is to get to the root, to undo the harm, which means knowing that colonization is throughout all of these spaces, a through line. Next slide, please. There's this tension, as I mentioned, between decolonization and anti-racism. And I am hopeful and optimistic that the Council on Black Health is going to be the group that ends this tension. As was mentioned, Edgar's a good friend of mine as well, and the importance of us valuing and honoring our indigenous brothers and sisters in the United States and the work that they've done around decolonization, and also tying it to the global movement of all the indigenous peoples who are around the world, right? How do we show that this hierarchy is not one that's just a US-centric and US-focused, but a global phenomenon around decolonization? Because that's really ignoring this kind of globalness around it causes us to have harm. And I know from our repro work, when we act as if the United States is the only person or the only state that's involved in this work, we just export our harms to other countries, to other nations, and cause to have more trauma around the world. Next slide, please. And so what can we do to operationalize decolonization? And we wrote an article in The Lancet about this, and this is really focused on medical education, but it could be with with anyone, really anti-racist. We have to have anti-racist pre-medical, medical, and continuing education. We have to diversify the workforce. If you think about right now, a lot of focus, I get offers all the time. People want Black women-led organizations. Now we're the new hot thing. So what they'll do is just put a Black woman in charge of a white-focused organization. So we even have to evolve our language around that. So it's not just Black woman-led. Are you Black people focused in your work? Are you ensuring that all people are included? Making sure that you have diverse engineers, making sure that as a provider, you're actually an advocate. You can't just provide care without being an advocate. And ensuring that we have single payer. We know that as long as healthcare is treated as something like you're buying bread, you have a choice between going to a grocery store, that people of color, Black people, will still die. Next slide, please. We must establish our own systems to collect and disaggregate health data, right? Because if I talk to my indigenous sister at the Urban Indian Institute, they really collect their own data. They're fighting with the CDC right now about the data. Their data shows that their birth outcomes are worse than Black people, which I believe. There's reason to believe that. So then why we need to ask for our own data? How do we hold the data? How do we honor our own data for our own selves? How do we take that practice of believing and trusting in our own communities and push back on the government's ownership? We need to have standards related to structural racism. Right now, every time I'm in meetings, they want metrics. None of the metrics are around structural racism metrics. We need to develop and decolonize and show in these systems the ways that structural racism are performance measures that you can undo them through standards in your healthcare system. But we also know this, the healthcare system alone isn't equipped to overcome these issues. So that's why we have to have collaborations with folks like the Council on Black Health, because providers, OBGYNs, midwives, nurses, we cannot do this work. It really is a village, the village of Black folks in order to get this done. Next slide, please. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll have Starsky and Joya join me, and if our tech team can go ahead and put us and highlight us on the screen together so that we can ensure we have a joint conversation. So, I mean, I tell you what, I wrote down about 3 million things. So I think we've gotten some serious framing, and I want to start with some questions that kind of dig a little bit deeper than where you had all started going. We've got context for framing. I loved what you said, Joya, around being Black people focused versus Black individual led. I mean, that just really spoke volumes for me. And then Starsky, as you were thinking about this idea of making another person human, that just blew me away, right? To accommodate your own image based upon fear, right? And just being able to understand it and digest both of those. So let's start with this question. And so you've already started to define decolonizing for us, but let's talk about this ways that we, right, Black leaders, Black researchers, how have we been colonized, particularly in our work, in our thinking, and how has that been harmful? Let's talk about it from that standpoint.
Yeah, I use two very specific examples. You
Okay.
talked about us going to school in New Orleans. I went to Xavier University, a historically Black college. Proud of that. Glad I got the degree. Glad I had the experience. Most importantly, that's where I met my wife. So most important thing. Every student at Xavier University who graduated during the time I did in the 1990s had to go through a mandatory public speaking class that had an obligatory component on code switching. Right? And so in this, we as rising Black professionals, middle class by global standards, even if you understood yourself as poor in the context of America, were being taught how to go along and get along in a white dominant culture, which would be the atmosphere that we were going forth into. Many in our context, like my wife, medical professionals. Xavier produces more African-American pharmacists, more African-American doctors than any other institution. And so as we talk about this, right, we're talking about how we send people forth to reflect a culture that they must integrate into. And for those of us around my age, I won't locate anybody else, we were taught about how to succeed through such integration through cultural and symbolic marks. The other I'll use very specifically, I became a president of a foundation, so working in the context of philanthropy. It was also a church-related foundation. So I was the first African-American to ever lead this institution, the first Black male to lead a foundation in the St. Louis region, or an independent philanthropy in the St. Louis region. And I spent my first 3 years trying to prove to people that I could do the job as well as the 60-plus-year-old straight white man clergy who had the job for 15 years before me.
Right.
And so that seeking of demonstration of efficacy in the context of organizational development, which yes, I'm good in that. I do very well. Yes, I know board development, but what I wasn't was free to be me and my whole self in response to the realities of my lived experience that were necessary for me to bring in and put on the table so that I might engage in transformative leadership in that place. And quite frankly, it was not until there were uprisings in my community that I connected more based upon my lived experience and my own, reflecting on my own reality. That began to be the capital from which I led, not the competition or the comparison with my capacity to demonstrate the marks of a white dominant and to navigate within a white dominant, quote unquote, professional culture. So these are ways in which we have indeed been colonized. And we've got to undo that work.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have similar stories as you as well, but we'd be remiss as a person who works on Repro to not show how patriarchy shows up in this white domination, right? And so it's a core tenet of this belief that only men can do and have. And so it shows up in how we pick who should be leaders. It shows up in Black leadership, who we support to run for office, who we support to get jobs. And so this mixture, I think, what I love about being able to talk about colonization is you can talk about both how it's about the color dynamic, right? So white supremacy includes also, though, things around gender, around religion. Like it's not just one hierarchy, there are multiple hierarchies. And so making sure that we don't replicate those to win. And when we do focus groups, frequently we'll find that the closer you are to the Deep South, the more people do the code switching more, right? So like when we talk to our sisters in New York around their experience of healthcare, they're like, oh, the doctor was horrible. You know, they are fighting for this and fighting for that. And when we do interviews in Georgia, they're more likely to be kind. They say, well, the doctor was busy. You know, the doctor.
Mm,
And so I would say to my fellow researchers, it's not that the ones in New York are so much smarter or better. You have to navigate white supremacy very differently. How the closer you are to dying due to it, right? So the more that
yes.
it's survival. So part of the reason that we do these things, like say you must cut your hair or know how to code switch at a HBCU, is because that was a survival technique to actually live, right? Like we had to do these things to
Right.
not be murdered. So what does it look like when we don't have to do these things? That's the decolonization. How much of this now yielding our power, centering Blackness and saying we don't have to tell our children to cut their hair. We don't have to say that it has to be a man that's in charge. That none of those are really our how we're oriented to the work, that we believe that people should be able to be their full selves and that we don't believe in gender exclusivity. You know, like that's really what's important to Black people of color and like leaning into that, decolonizing that.
What was interesting, so I went to Tulane, so I went to the white school in the city, right? So the same class, different context, right? But we had a class on how to be Black on campus.
Right.
I mean, the ACT set you up for this. I mean, we laughed about it, but it's really true. Shout out to Carolyn Barber. I mean, we had sessions to prepare. And I went to school in the 90s as well, where David Duke was still running for office, right? So we were in the midst of Louisiana's craziness.
Yeah.
And we're sharing this with the audience because part of this conversation with colonizing is really opening the door to really why we do what we do, why we respond the way we respond, and how that affects not only health behaviors, but health systems.
Yep.
So I'm going to dig into this a little bit further. How do we, or what does it mean to decolonize in ourselves and our thinking? Because what we're talking about now is really tapping into what many researchers, many practitioners, right, not just in healthcare, in any industry, any sector, but what does that mean to decolonize yourself? And then I see all the chats coming in. We're going to be taking those audience questions in a few minutes, but let's talk about this. What does it mean and how do you even do it?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Joya, get us started there.
Yeah, well, I'll start. I mean, I'm constantly working on it still. I will say something simple. It might sound crazy to y'all, but it's a fact, right? So I make my husband's plate. It's very Southern of me. It's very Black woman of me. It's what I saw my grandmama do.
Right. What you saw your mama do.
What my family saw. It's what we do, right? It's a thing. And my daughter every time looks at me like I have lost my mind, right? She's like, what are you doing? And then I have to realize here's what I really understand. It is a part of me that doesn't necessarily have to be. She might not ever do it. It's not a big deal. What I don't want is people to legislate that we must do it. And so the reason that colonization was so deadly or is so deadly is there are these behaviors that we've normalized that I do that are, still steeped in patriarchy, still steeped in tradition. It's fine for me to do it in my house for myself. Decolonizing means me understanding that about myself and saying, but I would not make that a law and a rule if I had power to say all women must make all their husbands' plates, right? Like that's what we've been doing. That's the switch. That's the difference. So it is not that I expect people to rid all the things that are in their heads that come from tradition and culture and beliefs. But when you create those into actual policies that limit people's ability to thrive, then that's when it becomes a problem to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, as I think about colonization as different elements of exploitation, of control, and of division, right? Establishing systems to do those things. Again, as Dr. Perry noted, based upon a hierarchy of human value. Then I think decolonization has to be responding to those things. So how do we respond to division? We do that through connection. How do we respond to exploitation? We do that with a sense of belonging, but also taking the opportunity to resist. And so we got a great explanation. We have a great kind of subject lesson in how to decolonize oneself, right? In a context of capitalism and exploitation of human energy and celebrity in the interest of capitalism, we see Black women saying, "Nah, I'm gonna take a break." Simone Biles taking the opportunity to say, "I'm gonna take care of myself." Naomi Osaka saying, "I'm backing up for a moment to take care of myself," is an act of decolonization because it resists systems of production that are based upon human exploitation.
Exactly.
And so in as much as we do that, in the theological context, Walter Brueggemann talks about Sabbath as resistance. In as much as these systems are meant to exploit and to churn us, when we remove our labor from them in the interest of self-control, self-determination, then we are indeed decolonizing ourselves, and we are resisting colonization by these systems. And so I think we got great examples of that right now.
Yeah. Let's dig here. The Black Health Bill of Rights. I don't know if you've heard about it, but hot off the press again, shouting out the Council on Black Health, who created a Black Health Bill of Rights. I'm going to read a few articles inside the Black Health Bill of Rights because I know with Shariki, who is our founder, some of our board members on the line, Tambra, Militia, all the folks that had some work that was done in this, Jamita. I've got to read some of these articles to give us context. And I'm going to ask a question. Article 1 says, we have the right to a culture of health that values our whole well-being and allows us to achieve optimal health. Article 4 says, we have the right to approach solutions to Black health from a strengths-based approach that incorporates a decolonized and intersectional lens to health equity. That's a whole word right there. Like I want to just roll in that, right? Now there's a question that came in on the feed. I'm connected to this article. Is there a tension between an anti-racist and a decolonization framework? And let's think about that out loud together, because I think there's a great question. Because anti-racism practices and anti-racism training and processes have been, I believe, put in place to try to do the thing that actually decolonization is supposed to do. Anti-racist practices, anti-racist training gives an organization, an institution, a sector, an opportunity to begin to, one, I think, assess the way that they've practiced, assess the policies that have been implemented. But decolonization, I think, is a little bit more personal. I want to just kind of offer that as a thought. Do you all see the tension between anti-racist work and decolonization? And in hearing about how the Bill of Rights have really talked us through this strengths-based approach to Black health, is the tension is there tension there that allows us to actually operate with both anti-racist practices and decolonization? Are they different? Are they the same? Are they connected? What do you all think?
I'll go first. I think you had a lot of questions in there. Let me just say
I
that.
did.
So I started with one, I got to 2, 3, 4. It was about 5 questions in there.
I had to give you 3.
But I just want to start with, there is definitely a tension, and the tension in general is about ownership. And this is what I was trying to get to around when people have been marginalized. And so what we honor as Black people is for the people who originated an idea. So usually when I hear us talk about decolonization, we are honoring the fact that from where we sit, our Indigenous brothers and sisters created that framework. It's just like talking about reproductive justice and not mentioning Loretta Ross. Right? So white women do this all the time, and I fuss with them like, you can't just be talking about reproductive justice and you've now made it mean this other whole thing, and you've never met Mama Loretta. Like, I'm gonna need you at least to say her name,
just say her name,
what she was doing, right? So that's the tension I feel around, like decolonization was clearly in the US context of something that was created by our US indigenous folks. Okay, so that's clear. So honoring that, how they made the framework, and so their framework has a lot more to, as Starsky mentioned, land. Tied to the land. We don't talk a lot about that in anti-racism, right? Ours is not about, because we were brought here. We lived so it's not so like it took us from land. So I'm hopeful that we can honor that there's a tension and then value both, right?
Okay.
See that there's a both and see that there's value in the decolonization. And also I'm learning from my global partners around decolonization. So that's what I was trying to bring up, that decolonization is not just in the US context. The first people that I heard about it from were actually folks on the African continent, because we were deeply colonized on the African continent. So it's also seeing yourself as African. Do people in the US still see themselves as African? Right? How much of your Africanness shows up in your work? How do you move in space and honoring your Africanness? So I will say, growing up in a place like New Orleans, I feel very African, right? I was
absolutely, that makes sense,
where Blackness was the default. Even when they were trying to beat us up, Blackness is the standard. So even the white folks who are in charge, they're trying to act like Black people, trying to dance, trying to sing, trying to be in Black spaces. So I have a very different orientation around valuing my Africanness, seeing that as a pure part of who I am as a human being. I don't know. So for me, that tension is not as strong around having an either or, because I can see people as also indigenous around the world. And I can also see the value in learning both traditions.
Starsky, your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think in order for them to work together, I think there has to be a healthy understanding and appreciation of both. And I think there has to be a radical appreciation of decolonization as in the context of return and sovereignty. That when we think about decolonization as everything, look, I'm gonna be a preacher again. I want back everything the devil stole from me. I want it all back, right? So when we think about it in the context that land has been taken, identity has been taken. I'll talk about the US context, whether it is the forced integration in the interests of social uplift of Black people, or whether it is the schooling, the housing, and the killing of Native people in the context of North American displacement, or the cordoning off into parts of America, right? I want my identity back. I want my land back. I want my work back and or the value thereof. So in American context, that means reparation.
Yeah.
So if we think about decolonization in the context of full sovereignty of humanity and return of the things that have been stolen, if we can be that broad, then I think we can work, use an anti-racist framework in that context. But the broader piece is still the more global piece, as Dr. Perry has noted for us, that the broader piece has to do with decolonization. But we have to be willing to be expansive. We have to be willing to be radical in that view, that it's not just, we can't be tinkering in systems. And quite frankly, I think this is part of our challenge. If we don't think about return, if we don't think about going back to wholeness, then we will continue to color within the lines of the small P's without not just the big P of policy, but the big P of power. And so we walk into these contexts where, and we continue to wrestle generationally, because the people who look like us, folks who go, who make potato salad like us, have been able to succeed in these systems, not just because they were so excellent at being Black folks.
Right.
But we're still at a point generationally where the people who we've seen succeed have done so also because they have been swimmingly successful in navigating white dominant culture, if not reflecting it in order to do so.
Yeah. Okay, you gotta stay there. You stay there.
Yeah, but can I just want what?
Go ahead.
Just because
I'll write it down.
In reading Caste, there's a moment in Caste where Martin Luther King is in India and they introduce him as an untouchable, and he is offended at first. And then he has to rethink about it. And in fact, Black people in the United States have been the untouchable class since they brought us here and stole us. So then what I feel a lot of times when we're talking about this work is our Americanness shows up so much.
Yes.
Right? And so
that's
it's
where I was
hard
going.
for us to work through our Americanness, to see our tie to our Africanness, to our culture. Like, what makes you then be Black? And I ask white folks all the time, if we're, I don't hate white people, I hate white supremacy. So tell me, what makes you supreme? What makes you white beside being supreme? And I like that part, right? So for Black folks, figuring out what makes us be Black, what is the thing we value? How do we move in space? So I have a clear sense of that for myself. I don't know that is something we have had a conversation about as a people, there's
not collective clarity.
Exactly.
And that's really the next question, because this idea of clarity on the impact of colonizing on the way that we operate, particularly for researchers and practitioners, right? We're in spaces that in many times, not only are we on our own, but we'll assimilate and assign new values in response to what is going to get us to the next step, right? How do we survive? How do we ensure our family's okay? Because and I want to be clear that these are real realities for many of us, that all of us that are having this conversation, we have either lived it, are still dealing with it, and want to just offer that this is a safe space of you are not alone. Right. But how do you navigate and stay healthy here? And that's the question that I want to bring forth. And then we got one more, and then we're gonna bring in these chat questions. But how do you prepare yourself for the journey? Because to do this work that we're talking about doing, it means we have to bring up race, we have to bring up class, we have to bring up gender, we got to bring up politics, we have to bring up everything that is really shamed in public workspaces or shamed in many of our daily lives. So we're not supposed to talk about these things, when in essence, everything is driven by all of these isms that we've been tapping into. So how do you care for yourself in this process of trying to decolonize your thinking, but also how do you survive when colonization is all around you? So what do you do? How do you take care of yourself in this journey?
Well, I know that the Reverend, y'all have spiritual guidance.
There's a few
Well, I
things we
think
could say.
I do think, I think you're right about this, this sense that there has to be a definition of flourishing and thriving that
Yes.
is different than the one that the system will honor and even reward,
Yeah.
and maybe different than the ways we were formed.
Yep.
I think because part of it is, I don't know that you can long term. I'm not saying you can't. I don't know that you can long term navigate these systems and remain whole.
Right. Agreed.
Oof.
So I have a sense that your definition of success must be something other than advancement in such systems. The late Father Philip Linden at Xavier taught and led the theology department. He taught me African-American Christianity, and I loved him. First, I loved him because he started the class with signifying monkey. I didn't know what they had to do with African-American religion and Christianity, but I loved it. But what I do, he talked about the process of signification.
Mm.
And he said that one can only signify the systems. You can only engage in the work of Brer Rabbit, the trickster, in the systems so far.
Yep.
Because after a while, the signifier becomes signified, and the signified becomes a signifier. You navigate so much within these systems, and you play these systems and these roles such that you actually become them at some point. And so
Right.
I think in order to be whole, to thrive, to be well, we must develop for ourselves a sense of success, flourishing, and well-being that is wholly outside of the forms of success that the systems and white dominant culture tell us are appropriate for us.
Listen, that's a whole word. We when med school, there's a lot of Black women who, from Xavier, who are my friends and colleagues who are physicians, and we have this joke that to survive in healthcare, you either have to take the red or blue pill, right? So you either go in, you take the pill, you act like you don't see nothing, like everybody who looks like you're getting treated crazy, the nurses are talking to you crazy, you just make your 6 figures and go home. Or you see it everywhere and it drives you nuts and you're constantly fighting with them and you're losing privileges. I was that person, right? So it's constantly.
You took that pill?
I took that pill. Like, woo! And it's hard to turn off. Like, it's hard not to it is so in every part of the system is constantly beating up. And so I was able to make my own organization who, we got some money in the beginning from philanthropy. Then philanthropy is fickle. They didn't give us money for a little while. And so we still soldiered on and made money off of contracts and still continued on. And now we're back sexy again. And I don't know how long, philanthropy is fickle. I don't know how long that's going to last yet again. But making a space that I don't have to take a red or blue pill, that I could just be, is how I stay sane. I'm the same people who fought me before now pay me to teach them about anti-racism.
Right.
Who knew? So, it's just like, I feel like as long as we keep, maybe that's the optimism in me. As long as you keep our ethos, as long as we keep our spiritual core, as long as we believe that we're fighting for something bigger, that, we will die in peace knowing we fought the good fight. I mean, that might be, it might be Pollyanna, but that is how I survived. So I've gone years without getting philanthropic dollars to do the work that we do. But I believe in the work. And so, now we've quadrupled in size in 1 year.
In 1 year. So I'm going to start hitting these chat notes here. There's a question from actually our founders. I see Shariki's note here. Love to hear about this concept of colonization to remake others. Is it driven by economic motivation? So is this a chicken or egg phenomenon? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I've heard Ibram answer this. I'm gonna put on my Ibram hat.
Yeah.
He would say,
That's where I was going to. You got it.
he would say that people use use racism to get their own personal gain. So
Yeah.
rich people use it as an excuse to get more money. Like, we can use our past president. He wouldn't have said half the things that he said when he got into political power, even 20 years ago, but it became a
Absolutely.
thing to say in order to get into power. So it's just an easy trope to get more political power, to get more money. And it's been indoctrinated for so long that it's hard for people, including Black people, to see all the ways that it shows up, to see all the, I have to argue with Black folks that we don't have a Black gene. I'm like, dude, if y'all don't know this, Lord help us. The rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, that's where it meets. I think this is really important, where I think all Black people are organizers, or should be. Let me just say that.
Straight
And
up.
I say that first and foremost, we have to understand power mapping, right? And the reason why I like that anti-racist framework that Ibram lays out here is because he suggests that the beginning of racist policies is racist ideas. The beginning of racist ideas is self-interest,
Yes.
power. So you have to map to the power interests in order to get at the core of this. And then you begin to see systems and how they work and why they work the way that they do, right? They work ultimately to protect or to accumulate, to gather together the self-interest of a small core of people, usually dead white straight men and their descendants.
As the name standard.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's Chris Tucker.
The default human being. Default human being, 70
Follow
kilos.
the rich white man.
Right, literally. This question goes back to the conversation. I think, Joy, you tapped the nerve here. Got some folks thinking, right? This idea of brain drain, where you're looking for Black people to lead white organizations and white universities. So it's a step up for them, and it's also a sign of achievement. But it may decrease their ability to be Black focused when it actually matters.
Yep.
So at that point, one can become a steward of a colonizer's mission. So the real question is, how do we help train Black leaders in that space?
Yeah, man. I mean, it's happening a lot in repro. I mean, think of repro is having a reckoning. I don't know so when I say repro, the field of reproductive rights and health, not justice, rights and health, has been heavily dominated by white women for 50 years. And so there was a reckoning around the fact that although it has been feminist, it's been white feminists. So they've been treating their staff crazy. They have been, doing all kind of stuff across the globe. So everybody's losing their jobs. I would say 80% of repro is in turnover right now. And so now they're hiring Black and brown women to take over these organizations that have been for 50 years, white women focused and led. And so here, a Black woman's gonna come and save the day and fix all of the harm of white supremacy by herself with a white board, white staff, but she's gonna do all the magic and fix it by herself. And so, yes, we are trying really hard to support them. Every time I have a phone call from one, I'm like, sis, I got you. I don't know about your board and your staff, but I'm here to try to help you figure this out. But also building like some community for that group, right? Because that's the next wave of who's gonna get hurt, who's gonna get hit. Like we can't blame and shame them. We need to have them moving in spaces where they're taking over in the repro space. However, it's going to be hard, and they're gonna need support. They're gonna need connection. They're gonna need safety. They're gonna need a lot.
Yeah.
And I think this has a lot to do with, we've seen this phenomenon in philanthropy. Over the course of the last decade, we've seen some of the largest philanthropies in the US come to be led by Black people, in the same time that we've had something called the D5 Coalition assessing how philanthropy has been doing in the context of diversity and equity. And what we saw was in that same period of growth of African-American presidents of philanthropies or CEOs of philanthropies, we actually saw a flattening of African-American program directors. And we did not see an increase, a relative increase in dollars to Black communities or Black-led organizations in that same time period. So that is to say that HNIC syndrome does not resolve the issues of investing in Black communities. So we've got to detangle those two. It also gets to something that Dr. Creel Perry noted earlier, this idea of identification. What does it mean to be Black? So one of my mentors, Mike Jones in St. Louis, who's out of political context, said there's a difference between an African-American elected official and a Black politician. A Black politician, he suggests, is a politician because they understand power and how to use it. An elected official is somebody who knows how to get elected. But the difference between the African-American and the Black for him has to do with a sense of a social consciousness and a commitment to serve Black people who sent you forth. And so this idea that in the position of power, we have responsibility to Black people is a consciousness that has to be curated and cultivated among those who, in the context of your question, have been drained out of our community or our institutions to lead white institutions or to die on the vine of them. Because that's part of the option too right now, is you could be called forth in this moment and be swept into this white dominant culture and wiped away with the tide 5 years from now when people are beyond their George Floyd money and commitments, philanthropic, corporate, or otherwise. And so I think there has to be some work. I'm glad that folks are circling around, but I think there also has to be a building of community among these Black leaders and white leaders and white institutions to understand, to curate a consciousness and an accountability to Black people, and to begin to develop outcomes for the institution that are reflective of their lived experience and the folks who are hurting.
And you are bringing context to this because the George Floyd, I call it the Floyd phenomenon.
Yeah.
Because last year was unprecedented.
Yes.
And I've had a number of conversations with colleagues saying, listen, this is not the first brother who was murdered on television, the first brother that was beaten on television, but it was the first time the country had stopped and had to watch it on television. And it was the first time that we had in a long time, a number of generations alive together to be able to look at this with very similar lenses and very similar frameworks. And so many organizations, quite frankly, have been solvent now because of the Floyd phenomenon. But the question is, will the investments in these organizations surpass this kind of short window that we have to address issues around anti-racism and, quite frankly, decolonization? Thoughts on that? Will we be able to be solving and continuing this?
I'm nervous. I'm trying to get somebody to give me an endowment because I don't have a lot of faith in my faith in my philanthropy leaders.
Yeah, you shouldn't. You shouldn't.
Right.
And I say that, I say that from my position, not to besmirch any of those folks, but I say that from the position of having worked in that space for the last decade and knowing how these systems work.
Yeah.
Right. Not the leaders, right? I'm the chair for the National Committee of Responsive Philanthropy. It is a 50-year-old organization, nearly 50-year-old organization that was established to hold philanthropy accountable to investing in underserved communities, to hold philanthropy accountable to using its best efforts and to be transparent and to invest in organizing, advocacy, and public policy work in order to get to racial justice and social justice. And so we wouldn't exist if you could trust it on its own, right? So I just say that like that. But I think this question about, whether we will last, and I said it now, leading an institution that has been beneficiary of some of that, and is sustained by that philanthropy in many ways. It has to do with what decisions we make about it. Are we going to, carry forth the wisdom that we have learned and been nurtured by, that this ain't gonna last always, and that we need to be diligent and be circumspect about how we make our investments to grow. In this moment, there is unique opportunity for us to do our work, but we need to plan for whether that means building an endowment now, whether that means making transformational investments, not just expansion with our dollars. And I do have a trust. I have a deep trust in Black leaders of these institutions that we're making decisions that are not just we're going to spend all the money this year and next year. Right. But rather we're going to invest it in, whether it's markets in the case of an endowment, or we're going to invest it in strategies for sustainability. I literally had this conversation with my board last Friday. How are we going to use this influx of resources? This is the plan. Yes. This is the market calculation on it. This is what's going to create a flywheel for other things so that we've got some resources left, right?
And
And
Siobhan,
I trust leaders are doing that.
And Siobhan, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up our desire to have a White House Office of
Please
Sexual
do.
Health and Wellbeing. And the reason why this fits into this conversation is because philanthropy cannot do this alone. Like, we need to codify this into the highest level of government. So we need anti-racism to be at the highest level of government. We need anti-gender oppression to be at the highest level of government. Like, we need this to be the way we do business going forward, and not just a side project of a few rich people, but really the fundamental switch so that Children's Defense Fund becomes the norm and the standard of how we talk about taking care of Black,
Yes.
brown, and marginalized community children, right? Like, that's
Mhm.
the switch that we need right now. And I think, and history teaches us a lot. Like, when Nixon was president, so many of these things were codified for my world. And one of them was we don't have free childcare, because when he went forth to sign it, there was pushback from the conservatives that we didn't want other people taking care of folks' children. Imagine how differently we would be as a world if we had free childcare for the last 50 years. Imagine how differently his anti-poverty strategy was family planning, was putting contraception clinics in Black and brown and poor communities. Imagine
Right.
if we had free college 50 years ago, how differently Black and brown communities would. So I'm saying codifying our ideas, not just through philanthropy, but in government, like saying we need free childcare, free college. Like, that's really where we need to be pushing for this to be a normal standard operating procedure for all governments.
And Joy, say specifically, what is it that you're working on so that people
Yes,
can hear?
yes. So we are asking for a White House Office of Sexual and Reproductive Health and Well-being. And the reason we use the word well-being is because your body is not just your physicalness. Your sexual reproductive health is also about sex ed. It's also about fibroid research. This is also about, we know, the queen, the mother of the movement, Mom, died in Mexico, getting treatment for ovarian cancer. That's not
Absolutely.
happening in the United States of America, right? So how do we really redefine well-being, that we honor the bodies of all gender expansive folks in this country at the highest level of government, and undo the racism and eugenics that has been currently put in place? So.
And how can the Council of Black Health help you in that endeavor, Joy?
Yeah, well, we have a sign-on lever. We have about 150 organizations who've signed on, everything from international orgs to US-based orgs, sororities. We've had, a lot of interest. We have 2 sign-on letters that went through Congress, one led by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, another one led by Senator Cory Booker. We have buy-in from the administration. It's really, the question becomes, are they going to act? Are we going to really act, right? So we
Yeah.
know there's buy-in. We would love for the Council on Black Health to help us to push for this action. We need to reclaim our bodies. Sexual and reproduction health is not only about abortion and contraception. Reproductive justice has never been about those 2 topics. It's always been the full range. Range of Black women are dying in childbirth because we don't have paid leave, equal pay, all the other stuff. So that is the kind of work that this office needs to do. Transportation is an issue. So we would love the support of the Council on Black Health.
And you see the actual call in the chat. So we've got it in the chat, looking at opportunities for folks to sign on and click right here so that you can support the MBEC team and those that are working in this space. Now, our last question is this, and it's for each of you. How can our audience take bold action in their workplace and everyday lives for advancing this movement of decolonizing? What can they do?
Yeah, I mean, the first step is constant learning in yourself. So that's where I am, honestly, rethinking how I even talk about even the word indigenous. That's a learning I'm doing for myself. And so I think all of us, like, spending some time with some self-learning is important. Finding room for rest. Rest is revolutionary.
Yeah.
Your schedule for that is decolonizing. Your labor is not the only thing that you're valuable for. So for so many of us, as I watched my mother and my father aging, I realized for so many Black folks, our labor was what we see our identity as, and how much comes from colonization. So how do we embrace rest? So I would say workplaces embrace that you deserve rest.
Good.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. So I say amen, hallelujah, ashe, so all of that. I'll also say, I mean, I think you really hit on something when you talked about Nixon's framing, the conservative framing of some of these issues. So I invite us also to listen with a critical ear and raise questions of of sovereignty
Mhm.
and of return when you hear political matters framed. So what does it mean then, as we talk about, we're doing work right now on advancing the child tax credit, making sure that these expansions are actually made permanent in the context that every other industrialized English-speaking nation has some type of family allowance. Why is it that we're talking about it for 1 year, 6 months, and not talking about it permanently? Who benefits from that? Well, when I know that 71% of children in poverty in America are Black or brown, then I know why certain people are challenging it. So I think listening with an ear that critiques old tropes and arguments, including those from our Black communities, that tell us that we're not worth certain things, or that we have to work for certain things rather than us having access to them because we are human. And I say that very specifically as a preacher shaped and formed in the life of churches that have also echoed much of that as parents of solid religious organizing on the right. So I think questioning policy conversations and frames will be helpful for us, and questioning them in the light of freedom, in the light of sovereignty, and in the question through the lens of return will be helpful for us in this moment where so many things seem possible if we're willing to lean in.
I'm going to add one more thing, and that is identify allies. A big part of this work that we're talking about right now, listen, we are in the throes of some of the most perilous times in our country's history. And a new administration did not just change things. If you had a chance to look at the hearing yesterday, I hope folks got a chance to see the testimony yesterday from the information from the insurrection. It should concern you as a Council on Black Health, as researchers, as practitioners, to know that what is being informed in our country stems from an excessive amount of history, but also present day challenges. And allies are a big part of the conversation. I know we don't have all Black members on this call. We have us also white allies that might be joining us. We are all a part of this equation. And I love what Joy said, that a lot of folks, and I've heard this from a lot of our white colleagues, that I don't see myself in this. Well, then you don't see equity, right? Equity has never been named a color, right? The work of equity, the work of advancing equity, the work of even thinking about decolonization has never been about a person. It has been about a system, and the way the system has been driven by dominant culture, male dominant culture, white supremacist culture, ableist culture, all of these cultures that are advancing in our institutions. And the work that has to be done cannot be just Joy of fighting for this office, which is why we have to mobilize and organize. So the Council on Black Health we're a nonpartisan organization, but we are factual. And what Starsky is getting at is understanding and looking at the root cause of why political plays have been used to tarnish an entire movement. And I think that we need to be very aware of what that means as practitioners. So yes, your research absolutely matters. Yes, your bedside manner absolutely matters. Your public health department work, it matters. Your philanthropy, it matters. If you're not at the table, if you're not seeking justice in the work, it is going to be detrimental to the advancement of Black communities. And realizing healthy Black communities is the purpose of this organization. And so I just want to thank, wow, this panel has been crazy. So I feel like we should go on the road with this one. This was crazy, crazy awesome. I mean, the chat was blowing up. It was amazing. I'm gonna ask Dr. Melissa Glover to join us before we jump off. I can tell you this, we have just seen and witnessed the kind of content that I believe that many of us are looking for in this country. We have heard the rhetoric, but it is time to move. And so, Melissa, while we close this out, I'm thinking about all the memberships and stuff that we need to do to get people back in the fold and get us moving.
Yes, thank you so much. You all, as always, were amazing. We appreciate you for kicking us off and really setting the stage, and particularly appreciate the wise counsel on getting ourselves ready for this journey, decolonizing ourselves and getting ourselves ready for this journey. We will come together again on August 11th, again from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern time, for the main portion of our 6-part workshop series for this year. And in that, we are inviting you all to be a part of this movement. So not being spectators, we certainly want you to come to council sessions. We want you to be fed, and then we want you to join us in moving forward and getting the work done. And so when you come together with us on August 11th, you will hear about the council's action plan. You will hear what bold actions have to be taken as it relates to research, policy, and practice for us to realize our goal of realizing healthy Black communities. And we have to be bold. Reverend Wilson and Dr. Creer Perry and Reverend Arline Bradley have called some things out for us, and we are now ready. And so what we are inviting you all to do is to become a part of the movement. So certainly continue to engage with us, listening to these webinars, but please do join us as a member of the Council on Black Health. That allows you to have access to all of the content that we have within the council, and also allows you, again, to play an active role in moving this work forward. We cannot do it by ourselves. We need all of you. We are looking for individual members. We are looking for organizations, because it's not one of us, it's all of us. And we have to do this work together. So again, I appreciate the panelists, and particularly Reverend Arline Bradley always does an amazing job of facilitating and being very thought-provoking. Reverend Wilson, if I could pass a collection plate, I would pass a collection plate, because you were amazing. Joya, you brought it home with the definitions. My phone is blowing up, my Twitter is blowing up, my Facebook page is blowing up.
It's crazy.
People are excited. So we look forward to you joining us again on August 11th from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. You will be receiving information about how to register for that session. If you know of other people who should have been here but weren't, please feel free to forward this information to them. We are welcoming everyone to join us in this effort. So please feel free to invite those folks to join us next time. You can join the council at www.councilbh.org. You can reach out to us at Council BH on all social media platforms, and we look forward to your engagement. Before I end, I do want to thank Adrian Cherry and Regina Baker, who spearheaded the work behind the scenes to get us all on the platform, and just want to publicly shout them out, because they usually don't appear on camera, but do know that they are always working behind the scenes to make sure you have access. So thank you all very much. We will see you on August 11th from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Take care, everyone.